Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. Let me know what you think in the comments. Enjoy listening. The sky was dark gray, almost black, when Sophia reached the town. The falling rain gave the deserted streets a shiny and sinister look, and the intermittent lightning illuminated the ancient buildings. After a long work trip, she hoped only to find rest in a comfortable hotel. The only one available in that remote location was a Gothic building, an old manor turned into a hotel whose grim appearance stood out against the landscape. As soon as she crossed the entrance, a chilling sensation gripped her heart. The place seemed wrapped in an aura of sadness and abandonment, despite the period furnishings and soft lighting. The silence was absolute, broken only by her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. As she approached the reception, she noticed portraits of ancient owners hanging on the walls. The eyes of those strangers seemed to follow her, as if wanting to warn her. At the reception, an elderly man with a vacant and penetrating gaze awaited her. His pale skin and bony hands contrasted with his formal attire. "Good evening," Sophia said with an uncertain smile. But the man did not smile back, merely staring at her with an ambiguous expression. After a long moment of silence, he handed her an ancient key. "Room 313, he whispered in a hoarse voice. Climbing the stairs, Sophia noticed that each step emitted a groan, as if the whole building were suffering. The carpet in the corridor was thick and worn, and every door she passed seemed to hold stories lost in time. But when she reached room 313, she felt a particular shiver. It was the last one in the row, isolated from the others. Once inside, she looked around. The room, though classically furnished, conveyed an air of decadent opulence. Even though she was exhausted, Sophia felt an unease she couldn't explain, as if the room were oppressing her. She decided to close the heavy curtain and immerse herself in the bathtub for a relaxing bath. A few hours later, when she went to bed, she tried to close her eyes and focus on sleep, but the silence was so profound it was almost deafening and unsettling. And then, in the dead of night, it began. Moans, muffled sounds coming from a wall. Sophia sat up abruptly, trying to understand the origin of those sounds. Curious and mostly worried, she brought her ear to the wall. A moment of silence and then those moans again. She then approached her room's door. She opened it slowly, glimpsing only the darkness of the corridor. Looking to her left, she saw only walls, as if her room were the last one. Yet, the moaning seemed to come from somewhere nearby. Returning inside, she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, a consequence of fatigue and the stress caused by her work and the long journey that had brought her there. She lay down again, pulling the covers up to her eyes, hoping sleep would free her from that nightmare. The longest night of her life seemed never-ending, as did the moans that did not stop. Sophia, eyes wide open, wrapped in the blankets, felt fear growing inside her. After yet another hour that seemed like an eternity, she decided she could not endure that torture a minute longer. She got up, turned on the light, and with a deep breath approached the window. The rain had ceased, leaving the air damp and cool. Sophia opened the window and stuck her head out, trying to see something in the night. Her room seemed to overlook a narrow inner courtyard. Looking to her right, however, she noticed a closed window with darkened panes a short distance from hers. That window seemed to belong to another room, as if hers were not the last in the corridor. Determined to discover the origin of the moans, Sophia left her room. The corridor was silent and dark, with only a faint light from the windows illuminating part of it and a few lamps that, given the light they emitted, might as well have remained off, she thought. Walking cautiously, she examined every corner, every door, every possible hiding place. And so, at the end of the corridor, she discovered a heavy, dusty curtain that concealed a door behind it. Sophia, gripped by anxiety, turned the handle, and the door, with a sinister creak, swung on its old, time-encrusted hinges, opening. The door led to another corridor, similar to the one she came from, but even darker and more unsettling. The moans, now more intense, seemed to envelop Sophia, penetrating every fiber of her being. After a few steps, she discovered an open room, also numbered 313. Summoning her courage, she entered. An indescribable horror presented itself to her eyes. The room was like a macabre theater, a place of violence and blood. In the center, a gagged man, with evident signs of torture, lay tied by his limbs on a large antique wooden table. Sophia felt her heart stop. Her legs gave way, and she fell to her knees. The horror of that place enveloped her, and that stench wouldn't let her breathe. She knew she had to do something to help that man, but at that moment, her legs wouldn't support her, let alone allow her to do anything else. As she desperately tried to think of a way to free him, she heard footsteps behind her. Time seemed to stop as she turned and saw the receptionist, with a wicked smile on his face. "You weren't supposed to find this place. It was supposed to be my task to bring you here," he said, grabbing her violently by the arm. This room is my masterpiece, and soon you will be part of it." Fear paralyzed Sophia for a moment, but then she found the strength to react. With a well-aimed kick, she freed herself from the man's grasp and started running towards the corridor, her heart in her throat and tears in her eyes. The corridor seemed endless. Every step of Sophia echoed like a drum. Behind her, the receptionist advanced quickly, his guttural laughter filling the darkness. The doors of the rooms passed one after another, but all seemed locked. As she ran, Sophia desperately tried knocking and shouting, hoping someone might hear her pleas for help. But the only sound that responded to her cries was the echo of her own steps and the sinister laughter of her pursuer. Just when despair was about to overwhelm her, an unexpected hope. Confused voices and frantic steps came from one of the doors. A group of 3 guests, alerted by the noises and screams, had come out of their room and now poured into the corridor. The receptionist, surprised and momentarily thrown off by this new presence, slowed his advance. At the other end of the corridor, a man in his 70s, with an imposing build, advanced determinedly towards the receptionist, while the other 2 flanked him. "What the hell is going on here?" thundered the man. staring at the receptionist with fiery eyes. At that point, Sophia didn't stop to look and ran towards the emergency stairs, descending and stumbling until she reached the ground floor. Once outside, the cold air stung her lungs, but it was the air of freedom. Away from the hotel's hell, Sophia didn't look back. She ran to her car breathlessly, thanking the dealer who had insisted on installing that particular feature. She approached, and the mere presence of the cell phone in her pocket allowed her to open the door and speed away as fast as her reflexes allowed. She knew she could not go back, not after what she had seen. But the fight for her life had reignited a spark of determination in her. She had to ensure that horror was brought to light, and that no one else had to suffer the same fate. With that thought in mind, Sophia drove towards the town's police station, determined to tell her story and seek justice. The night enveloped the town, and Sophia drove through the deserted streets, the noise of the engine breaking the silence like a dull roar. The air was cold and heavy, but the chill couldn't calm the fire burning inside her. Every now and then, she glanced at the rearview mirror, as if fearing to see the receptionist or his horrid abode appear behind her. The images of the horrors experienced in that hotel filled her mind. Sophia tried to shake them off, to keep the fear at bay, but it was like a tide that kept coming back. Every dark corner, every shadow seemed to hide a lurking danger. When she arrived at the police station, the silence of the building was almost unreal. At the desk was an officer, a man in his 40s, with dark hair and a face marked by wrinkles. Sophia told him her story, her voice cracked with fear and fatigue. The officer listened in silence. His gaze was impassive. When she finished her tale, the officer assured her they would investigate. Sophia felt a glimmer of hope, but it lasted only a moment. As she left the station, she glanced back at the officer and saw something in his eyes that made her shiver. It was a familiar and penetrating look. Only then did Sophia realize the horror of the situation. The officer was a younger version of the receptionist, perhaps a son or relative. In her heart, she was already sure her report would never reach the police archives. Indeed, it would be destroyed as soon as she crossed the station's threshold. It was as if the entire town was complicit in that dark evil. Sophia then decided to do the only thing she could think of at that moment. Get in her car and flee far from that sick town. She, in her car, was the only bright spot in the dark of the road. There was a profound sadness in her eyes, the awareness that, despite everything, the evil she had faced was still out there, ready to do more harm.